The metal doors of Station Alpha 7 slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the towering glass spires of the Galactic University of Military History. Professor James Miller adjusted his tie and gripped his worn leather briefcase tighter. After 6 months of space travel, he had finally arrived at his new workplace, though the butterflies in his stomach made him feel more like a freshman than a visiting professor. 2 tall figures waited in the reception area. The first was Dean Rax, whose silvery skin reflected the artificial lighting, making him look like a living statue. Next to him stood his assistant, whose many eyes blinked in an unsynchronized pattern that made Miller slightly dizzy. The dean's face tentacles twitched, a sign of displeasure that Miller had learned about during his cultural training. "Welcome to our institution, Professor Miller," Dean Rax said, his universal translator giving his words a mechanical edge. "Though I must admit, we were surprised when the Council insisted on including Earth in our exchange program. Your species has only achieved spaceflight in the last century." Miller smiled, remembering the briefing from Earth's diplomatic corps. "Stay polite, stay professional, and whatever you do, don't mention the time humans fought a war over a bucket." "Thank you for having me, Dean Rax. We may be new to the stars, but Earth has a rich military history to share." The dean's assistant made a sound like bubbling water, their version of a doubtful snort. "Rich, your species has barely survived its own developmental phase. Most civilizations resolve their violent tendencies before discovering nuclear fission." As they walked through the university's massive halls, Miller observed the other faculty members. Some floated in anti-gravity fields, others walked on multiple legs, and a few seemed to exist partially in another dimension. Students of various species hurried between classes, their movements as diverse as their appearances. The dean led them to a classroom, a circular chamber with seats arranged in rising tiers. "You will teach an introductory course on planetary conflicts. We expect you to focus on simple concepts. Perhaps start with how your people fought over farming territories." His tone carried the same patronizing note Miller had heard from other alien academics. "Actually," Miller said, setting up his teaching materials, "I thought we'd begin with the Battle of Thermopylae. It's an excellent example of how humanity's military thinking evolved." He activated his holographic projector, showing an ancient Greek phalanx formation. The dean's skin shifted from silver to a slightly darker shade. "You want to teach about battles from before your species had powered flight. What possible relevance could such primitive conflicts have?" Miller looked at his class roster, 30 students from 20 different species. None of them had ever heard of the Hot Gates or how 300 Spartans changed the course of human history. None of them understood how those ancient battles shaped humanity's approach to warfare, survival, and sacrifice. Dean Rax, with all due respect, understanding where we came from is crucial to understanding who we are now. These primitive conflicts taught us lessons that we still apply today, even in space warfare. Space warfare. One of the dean's face tentacles curled in alarm. But conflict in space is purely theoretical. No species would be foolish enough to. He stopped, remembering Earth's recent skirmishes with pirates in the Outer Rim. The humans hadn't just defended themselves, they'd hunted down every pirate base in the sector. "My first lecture is tomorrow morning," Miller said, pretending not to notice the dean's discomfort. "I believe several faculty members expressed interest in attending." "Yes, though I must insist you submit your lecture materials for review before." "All materials have already been approved by the Council," Miller interrupted smoothly. "They were particularly interested in our section on asymmetric warfare." The dean's assistant made that bubbling sound again, but this time it seemed more nervous than dismissive. As they left Miller to finish his preparations, he could hear them discussing something in their native language. Their translator deliberately switched off. Miller smiled to himself as he arranged his materials. Tomorrow, he would begin teaching these aliens about humanity's long, complex relationship with warfare. He would tell them about courage, sacrifice, and the indomitable human spirit. But most importantly, he would help them understand why, despite all their technological advances, Many species in the galaxy still felt uneasy around humans. After all, humanity hadn't just survived its violent past. It had learned from it, adapted because of it, and emerged stronger. And that, more than any weapon or technology, was what truly scared them. The classroom buzzed with alien chatter as Professor Miller set up his holographic display. In the front row, a student with blue crystalline skin caught his attention. Unlike the others who were gossiping about the primitive human teacher, this one was quietly studying the image of ancient Greek warriors that floated above the podium. Today, Miller began, silencing the room. We'll discuss a battle that shaped Earth's military thinking for over 2,000 years. He expanded the hologram to show the narrow pass of Thermopylae. 300 soldiers stood against an army of over 100,000. A student with tentacles raised 3 of them. Professor, there seems to be an error in your numbers. Such a battle would be tactically impossible. Miller smiled. Impossible? Let me tell you what happened. The hologram shifted, showing the massive Persian army facing the small Greek force. These soldiers, the Spartans, knew they would die. They chose to fight anyway. The crystalline student, who Miller now saw was named Blue in his roster, leaned forward. They knew death was certain, yet they fought. What was the tactical advantage? Time. Miller replied. Their sacrifice bought time for other Greek cities to prepare their defenses. They died so others could live and fight another day. A ripple of confusion spread through the class. A floating gas-based student expanded in agitation. But that defies all logical protocols. When faced with superior forces, the correct response is immediate surrender to minimize losses. Dean Rax, who was observing from the back of the room, nodded in agreement. His face tentacles curled in satisfaction at the student's response. Humans think differently, Miller continued. Throughout our history, we've often chosen to fight against overwhelming odds, not because we thought we could win, but because we believed the fight itself had meaning. He switched the hologram to show other battles. The Alamo, Bastogne, the last stand of the Swiss Guard. These weren't just battles. They were statements of will. Each time humans faced impossible odds, we learned something about ourselves. Blue raised a crystalline hand. What did you learn, Professor? We learned that victory isn't always about surviving. Sometimes it's about showing the enemy the price of victory. Miller paused as the universal translators struggled to convey the concept. These battles taught future generations that humanity would never be an easy conquest. A student with multiple compound eyes clicked in distress. But warfare is about resource acquisition and territorial expansion. Once defeat is certain, continued resistance serves no practical purpose. The dean's satisfied expression began to fade as he watched several students engaging intently with the discussion. Miller walked among the students, his voice growing passionate. Imagine you're a Spartan at Thermopylae. Your spear is broken, your shield is heavy, and you know death approaches. But you stand anyway. You stand because each minute you fight is another minute your family has to escape. Each Persian soldier you face is one less chasing your retreating allies. Blue's crystalline surface rippled with excitement. The battle becomes about something larger than survival. Exactly. Miller pointed to the hologram, now showing the final moments of the battle. The Spartans lost the battle but changed the war. They showed that humans would rather die fighting than live as slaves. This lesson echoes through our history. A heavy silence fell over the classroom. Even the floating gas student had condensed into a thoughtful ball. From the back, Dean Rax cleared his throat. Perhaps we should move on to more civilized forms of conflict resolution. Of course, Miller nodded. But first, let me ask the class something. In your species' histories, have you ever faced a moment where surrender was the logical choice, but you chose to fight anyway? The silence grew deeper. Students exchanged uncomfortable looks. Blue finally spoke, voice quiet but clear. We haven't. Our species developed past physical conflict before reaching such extremes. Is this why humans advanced so quickly? Because you were tested more severely. Miller noted Dean Rax's deepening silver color, a sign of growing concern. That's an interesting theory. Perhaps in our next class, we can discuss how these early lessons influenced human behavior during the World Wars. The World Wars. Several students asked in unison. Yes, Miller replied, watching the dean's face tentacles twist anxiously. When humanity took the concept of total war to an entirely new level, he smiled at their confused expressions. But that's a story for next time. As the students filed out, many still discussing the lecture in hushed tones, Blue lingered behind. Professor, I have a question about human military psychology. Miller glanced at Dean Rax, who was pretending not to listen. Yes. These Spartans, would humans still fight like that today? That's a complex question, Miller answered carefully. But I'll tell you this, humanity hasn't changed as much as some might think. The lecture hall was packed. Word had spread about the human professor's unusual teachings, and now additional faculty members lined the walls. Dean Rax sat in the front row, his silver skin reflecting the glow of the holographic display that currently showed Earth circa 1914. Miller looked at the crowded room and took a deep breath. Last time, we discussed battles of sacrifice. Today, we'll explore what happened when humanity took conflict to a global scale. He adjusted the display to show a web of alliances spanning continents. This is how World War I began, with a single assassination that triggered a cascade of declarations of war. A faculty member with crystalline antennae interrupted. Surely you mean a regional conflict. No species would be foolish enough to engage in planet-wide warfare. Actually, Miller continued, World War I involved 32 nations across 6 continents. Over 65 million soldiers were mobilized. He paused as the translators struggled to convey the numbers. Several students changed colors in shock. Blue, now sitting front and center, spoke up. Professor, our historical records show most species unified their planets before achieving industrial capability. How do humans manage to develop such technology while remaining divided? Competition, Miller replied. Each nation raced to build better weapons, faster ships, more efficient ways of fighting. The hologram shifted to show trenches stretching across Europe. This led to new horrors. Chemical weapons, machine guns, tanks. Warfare changed forever. A gaseous student condensed so rapidly they nearly liquefied. But what about civilian populations? Surely they were protected. Miller's expression grew grim. The concept of total war meant everyone participated. Factories converted to military production. Women entered the workforce en masse. Children collected scrap metal. Every aspect of society focused on the war effort. Dean Rax's face tentacles writhed in distress. This is precisely why we questioned including Earth in our exchange program. Your species seems to have an unhealthy fixation on conflict. With respect, Dean, Miller countered. Understanding our history helps explain humanity's current approach to galactic peace. He switched the hologram to show the Treaty of Versailles. After World War I, we tried to prevent future conflicts through harsh penalties on the defeated nations. It didn't work. Blue's crystalline surface rippled with interest. You mean there was another? World War II began just 20 years later. This time, humanity reached new levels of industrial warfare. The hologram displayed waves of bombers over burning cities. Several students left the room, their various physiologies showing signs of distress. The civilian death toll exceeded military casualties. Miller continued quietly. Cities were razed. Entire populations were targeted for extinction. Humanity learned the true meaning of industrialized death. A faculty member floated forward, their translucent body pulsing with agitation. This explains much about human psychology. Your species is clearly traumatized by these events. No, Blue interrupted, surprising everyone. They're not traumatized. They're strengthened. Each conflict forced them to adapt, to innovate, to become more resilient. The crystalline student turned to Miller. That's why humans advanced so quickly in space travel and defense technology, isn't it? You never stopped preparing for the next war. Dean Rax rose from his seat, face tentacles rigid with alarm. Professor Miller, I must insist you conclude this disturbing presentation. One final point, Miller said, switching the hologram to show the United Nations. From these global conflicts, humanity learned crucial lessons. We created international organizations, developed rules of warfare, and established concepts like crimes against humanity. He looked around the room. We didn't just survive our wars, we grew from them. After class, as shaken faculty members hurried away and disturbed students discussed the lecture in hushed tones, Blue approached Miller's podium. Professor, our historical records show most species unified through peaceful means. Those that didn't usually destroy themselves. How did humans survive? Miller glanced at Dean Rax, who was furiously taking notes nearby. Perhaps because we never stopped asking that same question, Blue. Each war taught us something. About peace, about survival, and about ourselves. And what's the most important lesson? Blue asked. That the best way to prevent war is to understand it completely, Miller replied. Which is why, next class, we'll discuss something that terrified even humans, the Cold War and the doctrine of mutual assured destruction. Dean Rax's notepad clattered to the floor. In the doorway, several faculty members froze, their various appendages and sensory organs registering shock. They had thought the worst was over. They were wrong. The tension in the lecture hall was thick enough to cut with a knife. Two senior members of the Galactic Council had joined Dean Rax today, their environmental suits humming softly as Miller prepared his materials. The dean's face tentacles hadn't stopped twitching since he'd seen the lecture title, Cold War, when peace meant preparing for extinction. Miller activated his hologram, showing Earth's divided state after World War II. We created weapons that could destroy entire cities, he began. Then we built thousands of them and pointed them at each other. We called it peace through strength, or mutual assured destruction. A council member's suit crackled as they spoke. You deliberately maintained a balance of planet-killing weapons. This was considered peaceful. The logic was simple, Miller replied, displaying images of nuclear missiles in their silos. If both sides knew a war would destroy everything, neither would dare start one. We kept peace by convincing each other we were ready for war. Blue raised a crystalline hand. But Professor, our studies show that 98% of spacefaring species abandoned weapons of mass destruction before achieving unified planetary government. How did humans advance while living under such threat? Fear drove innovation, Miller explained. We went to space partly because we were afraid the other side would get there first. We developed computers to calculate missile trajectories. We created the internet to maintain military communications during a nuclear war. The second council member's suit emitted a series of alarmed bleats. Your species achieved technological advancement through preparation for omnicide. Yes, Miller said, but something unexpected happened. As our weapons grew more powerful, we became more careful about using them. We fought smaller wars instead, proxy conflicts, guerrilla warfare, espionage. He switched the hologram to show various Cold War hotspots. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Korea. These became battlegrounds where larger powers tested each other without risking direct conflict. Dean Rax's color had shifted to a sickly gray. You engaged in smaller wars to prevent a larger one. This defies all rational behavior models. Humans are good at finding creative solutions, Miller said, allowing himself a small smile. When direct conflict meant extinction, we found other ways to fight. Special forces, cyber warfare, economic warfare. We got very creative. Blue's crystalline surface rippled with excitement. So humans developed multiple forms of combat simultaneously. Physical, digital, economic, psychological. Precisely, Miller nodded. By the time we achieved spaceflight, we had experience in every possible form of conflict and every possible form of conflict prevention. A student with compound eyes raised several appendages. Is this why other species find humans so unsettling? Because you're always prepared for war. Perhaps, Miller acknowledged. But it's more than that. Humans don't just prepare for war. We prepare for survival. Everything that threatened to destroy us ended up making us stronger. He switched the hologram one final time, showing modern military technology. Today, humanity maintains peace through strength, just as we did during the Cold War. We hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Blue finished, earning concerned looks from the council members. Dean Rax floated forward. Surely now that you've joined the galactic community, such preparations are unnecessary. The Council ensures peace through mutual cooperation and understanding. Miller looked at the Dean thoughtfully. Tell me, what defenses does Station Alpha 7 have against kinetic bombardment? The room fell silent. The Council members exchanged alarmed glances. None, Blue answered. The concept of attacking an educational institution is unthinkable. Humans think about the unthinkable, Miller said quietly. We plan for it, prepare for it, not because we want war, but because we've learned the hard way what happens when you're not ready for it. The council members hurriedly left the room, their environmental suits whirring in agitation. Dean Rax followed them, but not before giving Miller a look that mixed fear with something that might have been respect. As the other students filed out, still discussing the lecture in hushed tones, Blue lingered. Professor, I've been studying Earth's current military doctrine. Is it true that humans still maintain rapid response forces, even in peacetime? Miller packed up his materials carefully. What do you think, Blue? I think, the crystalline student said slowly, that I'm beginning to understand why the council was so nervous about having a human teach this class. Oh. Miller raised an eyebrow. Yes, you're not just teaching us about human warfare. You're teaching us how humans think. And that's what really scares them. The class fell silent as Blue floated to the front of the room. Today was student presentation day, and the crystalline being had chosen a controversial topic, the psychological evolution of human combat. Even Professor Miller leaned forward with interest, while Dean Rax's face tentacles coiled tightly against his neck. My research suggests something remarkable. Blue began, projecting data streams into the air. Humans didn't just survive their violent history. They developed a unique psychological framework because of it. The data streams formed into brain scan comparisons. Most species experience severe trauma when exposed to conflict. Their development stalls or regresses. Humans, however, showed a different pattern. They adapted, evolved, created art and literature from their wars. A bubble-like student burbled in confusion. Are you suggesting conflict made humans stronger? Not exactly. Blue's crystalline surface rippled thoughtfully, but it made them more resilient. Consider their entertainment. The projection showed scenes from human movies, books, and games. They turned their wars into stories, processed their trauma through creativity. Even their children play at war, learning strategy and teamwork through games. Miller nodded slightly, his expression neutral but his eyes showing pride in his students' insights. Most disturbing, Blue continued, is their ability to switch between peace and war modes almost instantly. The projection showed emergency response teams in action. Humans can go from peaceful daily activities to combat readiness in moments. No other known species can compartmentalize like this. Dean Rax floated forward. Are you suggesting this makes humans superior? Not superior. Blue's crystal structure flickered with diplomatic caution. Different. While we evolved to avoid conflict, humans evolved to face it. They don't enjoy war. They fear it, like we do. But they've learned to function despite that fear, perhaps even because of it. The projection changed to show human first responders rushing into burning buildings. They've taken ancient warrior virtues, courage, sacrifice, duty, and applied them to saving lives. The same psychological traits that made them dangerous in war make them valuable in crisis. A faculty member with quantum-shifting skin spoke up. This explains their rapid advancement in emergency response protocols. When that meteor struck Colony 7, the human ships were first to respond. Precisely, Blue agreed. They plan for disasters because they've lived through so many. They expect the unexpected. They're paranoid. Dean Rax interrupted, always preparing for the worst possible scenario. With respect, Dean, Blue's voice grew firmer, isn't preparing for the worst how they survived their own history. And isn't that why the council really wanted a human teaching this class? The room grew very quiet. Miller's eyebrows rose slightly. Look at their response to the Helix plague. Blue continued. Other species panicked. Humans had pandemic protocols ready. They'd made movies about similar scenarios, run simulations, prepared their populations through fiction and training. Their paranoia, as you call it, saved lives. The quantum-shifted faculty member rippled thoughtfully. They do seem to have protocols for everything, even theoretical scenarios. Because they've learned that the theoretical can become real very quickly, Blue concluded. They don't just study war, they study survival in all its forms. And they teach these lessons to each generation through their stories, their games, their movies. And now through this class. Miller spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. Blue's crystal structure glowed brighter. Yes, Professor. Because understanding human military psychology isn't just about understanding war. It's about understanding how a species can face extinction-level threats repeatedly and emerge stronger each time. Dean Rax's face tentacles had slowly uncurled as Blue spoke. You truly believe studying human warfare will benefit our peaceful society? I believe, Blue replied, that humanity's greatest achievement isn't surviving their wars, it's learning from them. And now they're trying to teach us, so we never have to learn those lessons the way they did. The room erupted in discussion. Even the faculty members were engaged in intense debate. Miller caught Blue's eye and gave a slight nod of approval. The student's presentation had done what weeks of lectures couldn't. It had made the aliens see human warfare not as a sign of barbarism, but as a crucible that had forged humanity's resilience. But in the back of the room, a shadowy figure took careful notes. The council would need to know about this new understanding of human psychology. It changed everything. The lecture had barely begun when Dean Rax burst into the classroom, flanked by 3 council security officers in their shimmering containment suits. Miller stopped mid-sentence, his hologram frozen on an image of the French resistance during World War II. This class is terminated, Dean Rax announced, his silver skin pulsing with agitation. The council has reviewed the course materials on asymmetric warfare and deemed them too destabilizing for our student population. The security officers moved to shut down Miller's teaching station, but Blue suddenly floated between them and the podium. You can't do this. We're learning crucial information about human survival strategies. Crucial. Dean Rax's face tentacles writhed in frustration. Learning how small groups can resist superior forces. How civilians can become combatants. These concepts threaten the very foundation of galactic peace. Other students began rising from their seats. The bubble-formed student expanded to twice its normal size. But that's exactly why we need to understand them. Humans didn't invent resistance. They just mastered it. Miller stood quietly, watching his students stand up one by one. Even the quantum-shifted student who had been so disturbed by earlier lectures moved to join Blue. Dean Rax. Blue's crystalline surface pulsed with determination. Did you know that humans have a saying? Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. We need to understand how they think. One of the security officers stepped forward, their containment suit humming. This goes beyond education. The council is concerned about the spread of human military concepts. Already, some colony worlds are discussing defensive preparations and resistance protocols. Of course they are. Miller finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. Because they're learning what humans learned long ago. That peace isn't just the absence of war. It's the readiness to defend what you value. Dean Rax's color darkened. That's exactly the kind of dangerous thinking we're trying to prevent. A peaceful society doesn't need to learn about guerrilla tactics or civilian resistance networks. Respectfully, Dean, Blue interjected, isn't that like saying we shouldn't learn about diseases because we're healthy? Humans study war to prevent it, not to start it. The classroom had become crowded as word spread through the station. Faculty members and students from other classes pressed in, their various forms filling every available space. The security officers looked increasingly uncertain. This class isn't teaching us to be violent. Another student spoke up, their bioluminescent spots flashing with emotion. It's teaching us to understand those who had to survive violence. There's a difference. Miller stepped around his podium. Dean Rax, when humanity joined the galactic community, we promised to share our knowledge. All of it. Not just our scientific advances, but the hard lessons that got us here. The Council fears. Dean Rax began, then stopped, his face tentacles drooping slightly. The Council fears we'll all become more like humans. Blue finished. But they're missing the point. We're not learning to fight like humans. We're learning to understand why they fought, so we can help maintain peace in better ways. The security officers exchanged glances, their containment suits reflecting the tense faces around them. One of them touched their communication device, presumably consulting with higher authorities. Dean Rax looked around the packed classroom, at the diverse array of species all united in their defense of the controversial human teacher. His silver skin shifted through several shades before settling on a more subdued tone. Perhaps, he said slowly, I have been too hasty. The Council's concerns about spreading military knowledge are valid, but knowledge itself isn't the enemy, Miller finished quietly. Fear and ignorance are. That's another lesson humanity learned the hard way. Blue's crystal structure brightened. Dean, what if we invited Council observers to attend the remaining lectures? They could see for themselves that understanding human military history makes us better peacekeepers, not better warriors. The security officers received some message through their suits and began to withdraw. Dean Rax's face tentacles uncurled slightly, a sign of reluctant acceptance. Very well, he said. The class may continue. But Professor Miller, his eyes fixed on the human teacher, remember that not all species process these concepts as easily as yours does. Miller nodded, hiding a small smile. That's why we're taking it one lesson at a time, Dean. After all, humans didn't build our understanding of war overnight. It took us thousands of years of hard lessons. As the crowd began to disperse, Blue remained by the podium. Professor, will you now tell us about how humans maintain peace through strength in the modern era? Yes, Miller replied, reactivating his hologram, because that might be the most important lesson of all. The final lecture of the term drew an unprecedented audience. The classroom's environmental systems hummed as they accommodated beings from across the galaxy. 3 council members sat in the front row, their ceremonial robes glinting under the lights. Dean Rax floated nearby, his silver skin now showing a subtle pattern that suggested acceptance, maybe even anticipation. Miller stood before them all, his hologram showing Earth's current defense fleet alongside its humanitarian missions. We've talked about humanity's wars, he began, but today we'll discuss how those lessons help us keep the peace. Blue, who had become something of a celebrity after defending the class, sat forward eagerly. The crystalline student's research on human military psychology had already been accepted for publication in the Galactic Journal of Psychosociology. Humans maintain ready response forces, Miller continued, not just for war, but for any crisis. When the earthquake devastated Colony 7, human ships were first to respond. When the Helix plague threatened the Outer Rim, human quarantine protocols saved millions. A council member raised a tentacle, but you still maintain weapons, defenses, military protocols. We do, Miller nodded, because we learned that peace isn't a natural state. It's something you must actively maintain. Like a garden that needs constant tending. The hologram shifted to show human peacekeeping forces helping with disaster relief across the galaxy. Our soldiers train not just for combat, but for rescue operations. Our warships carry medical supplies. Our military intelligence networks track natural disasters as closely as they track potential threats. The paradox of human readiness. Blue commented, crystal surface gleaming. Always prepared for war, but working hardest for peace. Dean Rax's face tentacles moved in what had become an expression of thoughtful consideration. We've noticed that human-protected trade routes have 60% fewer pirate attacks, yet your ships rarely fire a shot. The best victory is the one you don't have to fight for, Miller smiled. Another lesson we learned the hard way. Our history taught us that strength isn't about destruction, it's about prevention. The hologram displayed scenes from joint human-alien military exercises. We don't train other species in warfare. We train them in readiness. How to respond to crises, how to protect civilians, how to prevent conflicts before they begin. A bubble-formed student who had once been horrified by human warfare now expanded with understanding. That's why the Council really wanted this class, isn't it? Not to learn about human wars, but to learn how humans prevent them. Precisely. One of the Council members spoke, their translator giving their voice a musical quality. Though we perhaps didn't expect such thorough historical context. The room filled with various sounds of alien amusement. Even Dean Rax's skin rippled with what might have been a chuckle. My species, Blue said, rising to address the room, once feared humans because we didn't understand them. We saw their weapons and assumed they loved war. Now I understand. They study war so intently because they hate it so deeply. Miller nodded. Every human victory in war taught us to value peace more. Every battle showed us what we wanted to prevent. We don't celebrate our warriors because they were good at killing. We honor them because they sacrificed to protect others. The hologram showed one final image, human and alien crews working together to evacuate civilians from a solar storm. This is humanity's greatest weapon now, the ability to turn our hard-earned survival skills towards saving lives instead of taking them. Dean Rax floated forward. Professor Miller, the Council has approved an expansion of your course. Next term, you'll teach human crisis response and prevention strategies, though perhaps with slightly less emphasis on ancient battles. The room filled with appreciative noises from dozens of species. Miller smiled. Thank you, Dean. Though I should warn you, understanding how humans maintain peace means understanding what we're working so hard to prevent. We understand better now, Blue said, crystal surface glowing warmly. Humans don't prepare for the worst because they're paranoid. They do it because they've learned that being ready for the worst brings out their best. As the audience began to disperse, Miller looked out at the strange and wonderful variety of life that filled his classroom. Humanity's violent history had taught them how to fight, yes, but more importantly, it had taught them why to fight, to protect, to save, to preserve the peace that made moments like this possible. The Council members approached him, their robes shimmering. We have one last question, Professor. Will humanity's warriors ever truly rest? Miller thought of all the human ships out there, ready to respond to any crisis, standing guard over the peace they'd fought so hard to learn. No, he said quietly. And that's exactly why the galaxy can.